I'm Matt McClure, and this is Currents. A deadly outbreak of tornadoes claims hundreds of lives in the South. We'll find out what the church is doing to help. Plus, what is theology of the body? Ahead of his beatification, we'll look at this hallmark of John Paul II's pontificate.
What does it mean in and through our masculinity, our femininity, that speaks to an identity, a mission, and a vocation?
And The Tablet hosts a forum on another man on the path to sainthood.
We all knew him as a media giant, and we knew how famous he was, and everybody saw him on television, but I don't think we realized, what a saintly man he really was.
Well, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Devastation in the South. More than 200 people are dead after severe thunderstorms and tornadoes ripped through the region, flattening homes and businesses in the process. Inez Ferre has more on the story.
Daybreak sheds light on the destruction that now blankets the Southeast. Homes destroyed, lives lost, communities devastated, as more than 150 reported tornadoes tore across 5 Southeast states and then headed north. This YouTube video captures the fury that was unleashed.
It was terrible, and it all happened in like less than 2 minutes.
I thought I wasn't going to be living. I thought my life was over.
The death toll stands at over 200 and climbing. Tuscaloosa, Alabama was one of the hardest hit areas. A mile-wide twister swept through the town.
There's parts of the city that I don't recognize.
More than 35 are dead in that city alone, including students from the University of Alabama who were living off campus.
There's been massive devastation across northern Alabama. These long track tornadoes, they really tear up the landscape as well as homes, and especially in homes that are not very stable.
As the reality of their situation sets in, survivors can only hold on to hope.
The real recovery will be seen in the relentless spirit of our citizens. Throughout Tuscaloosa, citizens are reaching out to each other, demonstrating that our strength and our faith will overcome all, even in this darkest hour.
That is reporter Inez Ferre. Now, President Obama also spoke out about the death and destruction this afternoon at the White House. He plans to tour the storm damage in Alabama tomorrow. That state was, of course, as you saw, one of the hardest hit in yesterday's tornado outbreak. The president says he's directed FEMA to give the state the help it needs to recover.
I've already spoken to the governors of Alabama, Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Georgia, and I've let them know that we are ready to help in any possible way. I've declared a state of emergency in Alabama so that we can make all necessary resources available to that state. I've dispatched Federal Emergency Management Agency Administrator Craig Fugate to Alabama so that he can personally work with state and local officials. And I will travel myself to Alabama tomorrow to meet with those leading the response efforts, as well as the families who are reeling from this disaster.
And the church is stepping in to help the affected areas recover as well. To find out more about that, I spoke earlier today with Kim Burgo, the Vice President for Disaster Operations with Catholic Charities USA. Kim, thanks so much for taking some time out for us here on Currents today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as someone who hails from the South myself, I know that this type of tornado outbreak, maybe not on this scale, but tornado outbreaks and severe weather are kind of a part of life in the spring. But I can't remember one that resulted in a loss of human life like this on this scale anytime in at least the last several years. What are you guys hearing at Catholic Charities as far as the damage and devastation goes in the affected areas?
Yes, well, actually, we are still doing our assessments across the many states. There was a lot more damage, I think, than people realized. While we're all focused right now in Alabama, there was actually storms and damage that hit up in Missouri and clear across the whole United States. So we're hearing from agencies from Kentucky and Tennessee and Georgia and North Carolina and et cetera. So it's not just in Alabama that it's hit. What we are finding, though, is that communications is very difficult. There is a lot of issues with cell towers being down, people's cell phones that, of course, they were charged last night, but the cell batteries are wearing down. and so communications is becoming difficult. We are getting a lot of information from Twitter and Facebook, thanks to them, as we keep hearing reports of who's up and operational. Certainly this is a storm that I think started over the weekend and has kind of moved its way across the country. So in some of our areas, like for instance in Arkansas and Missouri, they're a little bit farther ahead, I think, in their relief and recovery efforts as those that got hit last night, obviously, who are still doing their assessments.
Sure. What is Catholic Charities doing in some of those areas where I guess kind of the relief efforts have already begun, and even in those places where, as you said, these storms just hit last night, still gathering information there? What is taking place right now?
Yeah, I can tell you, St. Louis reported they had about 1,000 families who were without homes. And so what they're doing is really looking at outreach to find temporary housing for them, provide some of their basic needs. Arkansas has about 3,800 families who are also devastated and very affected. They are doing things like locating food, providing gas cards, doing some short-term housing, looking for comfort kits. Some places during a tornado also look for some simple things like storage buckets, so that whatever remains are left, or whatever belongings are left of the family, can be stored in a secure area for them. So right now it's still very early to tell, but certainly some of these basic needs are being met.
Sure. And if our viewers here in the New York area would like to help out, how can they do that?
They can go to our website at www.catholiccharitiesusa, all one word, .org.
Okay, well, great. Kim Burgo, the Vice President of Disaster Operation with the Catholic Charities USA. We thank you so much for taking some time out for us here on Currents today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, stay with us. There's much more Currents coming up. Christian leaders call on Congress to protect programs for the poor. That story and the rest of the day's headlines next. Welcome back to Currents. I'm Matt McClure. Coming up later, with all the talk about John Paul, we'll look at another future saint. But first, let's have a look at today's headlines. U.S. bishops have joined other Christian leaders in calling for a circle of protection around federal programs that help the poor. In a statement, the leaders say they are committed to resisting budget cuts that, quote, undermine the lives, dignity, and rights of poor and vulnerable people. The leaders acknowledge the need for Congress to reduce future deficits, but they say it should not be done at the expense of hungry and poor people. Indiana Governor Mitch Daniels says he does not know whether he'll sign a bill that will make his state's abortion laws some of the toughest in the nation. The legislation would take away close to $2 million of the $3 million Planned Parenthood receives from the federal government. It would also prohibit using Medicaid at Planned Parenthood centers and would ban abortions in Indiana after 20 weeks. Daniels is considering seeking the GOP presidential nomination. He's been criticized for saying the next president should seek a truce on social issues in order to focus on fiscal matters. Well, in the latest chapter of the ongoing saga surrounding controversial pastor Michael Pfleger, Chicago Archbishop Cardinal Francis George suspended Pfleger from priestly ministry yesterday. And this comes after Pfleger said on a national radio show that he would rather leave the Catholic Church than be reassigned from his position as pastor of the Chicago parish that he's led for 30 years. In a strongly worded letter, Cardinal George asked Pfleger to pray about the matter for a few weeks. Back in 2008, Pfleger gained national attention and was suspended for almost 2 weeks after mocking then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton during an appearance at Barack Obama's former Chicago church. Well, a Brooklyn parish held a memorial service yesterday for one of the 2 war photographers killed in Libya last week. Friends and family packed Sacred Hearts and St. Stephen's Church in Carroll Gardens to remember Chris Hondros. The photographer was on assignment for Getty Images when he was hit by gunfire during the fighting there between rebel forces and Libyan troops. He later died at a Libyan hospital. He was 41 years old, was engaged to be married later this year. Well, priests continue to be the targets of deadly violence in Mexico. The Vatican news agency Fides reports that officials discovered the body of a Mexico City priest with wounds on the neck earlier this week. Reports say the murder may have been the result of an attempted theft. Now, according to a report released last month, as many as 162 Mexican priests received death threats last year, and 2 were kidnapped and killed. Well, turning now to Rome and the latest news on the upcoming beatification of Pope John Paul II. An Italian newspaper reports that during his first days in office, Pope Benedict rejected the immediate canonization of John Paul. The paper reports that Benedict had no doubt about John Paul's holiness, but ultimately decided not to skip the beatification process, the last step before sainthood. Well, before this weekend's beatification, there is, yes, another highly anticipated ceremony the world will be watching, the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton in the UK. William and Kate will marry tomorrow. An official with the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales says it is only right that Catholics strongly support the couple in prayer. Now, he says that Catholics are praying that the future king and queen always put their relationship first. Well, stay tuned. There's much more currents ahead. When we return, we'll have a look at John Paul II's groundbreaking work on the theology of the body.
And it really became the seed work that really is a key that unlocks every other part of his work throughout his pontificate. It really was a seminal work for him and for the church.
Welcome back. Well, in 1979, Pope John Paul II began a series of talks, 129 of them to be exact, all on a topic that at that point had been approached with some hesitation in the Catholic Church. During his Wednesday audiences, the late pontiff tackled the body and its connection to the spirit. Well, this major teaching of Pope John Paul eventually developed into what we know of today as the theology of the body. It's a guide to understanding human sexuality, love, and life that continues to shape the Catholic awareness of human relationships today. Well, to wade deeper into this substantial body of work, I spoke earlier today with Damon Owens of the Theology of the Body Institute. Well, Damon Owens, thanks so much for being here today. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. It's good to be here. Thanks.
Well, of course, today we're talking about theology of the body. And for those who might not exactly know what it is, they might have a rough idea. Give us a little bit, maybe the Cliff's Notes version or the Reader's Digest version.
The elevator pitch, right?
Right, exactly, of what theology of the body actually is.
Sure. Actually, the name was taken from a body of work, the beginning of a body of work that Pope John Paul II offered in the first 5 years of his pontificate. It was really his first major work. It was a series of talks he gave Wednesday audiences from September 1979 to November 1984. And it wasn't really until he was done that people realized that he was offering an entire catechesis, a real teaching, to relook at what it means to be a human person. Wow. What does it mean in and through our masculinity, our femininity, that speaks to an identity, a mission, and a vocation. Wow. And it really became the seed work that really is a key that unlocks every other part of his work throughout his pontificate. It really was a seminal work for him and for the church.
Sure. And what kind of an impact does that have on the church as a whole and on Catholic teaching? I know is it something that maybe people found difficult to talk about in the church before John Paul sort of, I guess, released this body of work over time?
Well, it needs to be understood in context, right? It is there are new ideas, but it really has to be understood in the building of what the tradition of the church has spoken about in the dignity of the human person. What he's offered is a new language, a new approach, using a slightly different but a philosophical approach. So the body of work can be somewhat philosophical as well as theological, but what is offered the church today really is a new lens, a new way to look at the experience of love. Sure. And how we live our own identity and our own call, our vocation, in and through our masculinity and femininity. So it very much draws from the deep tradition of the church, but really provides a language that's appropriate for the church today, really. Sure. For such a time as this.
And speaking of that, what are some things that people can draw away from it? Maybe a few examples, if you will.
Absolutely. At the Theology of the Body Institute, who I have the privilege of speaking with this body of work through, it really is broad in terms of whether it's young people and understanding the call of their femininity and masculinity to a motherhood, to a fatherhood, a real mission. And also for those discerning vocation, whether it's to marriage or whether it's what we call celibacy for the sake of the kingdom. That includes the priesthood, religious life, maybe consecrated virginity.
Sure.
But these are two broad and distinct states of life that express the fullness of our masculinity and femininity. So whether you're discerning those vocations, whether you're living them and trying to live the deeper meaning of those, it really provides, again, this lens of understanding who we are so that we know how then we live to be truly happy.
Sure. With the beatification now just really a couple of days away, has that sort of renewed interest in the theology of the body when it comes to people, inside the church, outside the church, in looking at the teachings of John Paul? Because this is pretty significant, a very significant part of his papacy.
Absolutely. There's really been a steep trajectory, if you will, in terms of the interest and the growth of theology of the body, and we certainly expect his beatification and certainly his canonization, we all hope for it to be a catalyst. But in truth, it's on such a steep trajectory in terms of interest, both in the church, outside of the church. It's drawing people back to the faith. It's renewing people's understanding of their own marriages, of their priestly, the celibate vocations, religious vocations, and it's answering some questions about some deep sexual hurt and wounds, really, that can be difficult to understand through some of the traditional teachings of the church. But getting to those teachings now through the language of Pope John Paul II and the theology of the body really is a liberating and a beautiful entrance back into the whole deep tradition of the church.
Yeah. And we've alluded to this, but let's speak to it directly, the impact on the legacy of John Paul, of the theology of the body. What kind of an impact does that have now as we approach the beatification and now, some 6+ years after his death?
Well, again, in the context, John Paul considered himself a son of the Council, the Second Vatican Council, and I think it would be fair to say that what he's offered is a way for us to enter into the goals of that Second Vatican Council, of the pastoral approach to this treasure of faith, but using it in a way that can be understood and approached in the modern culture. So the legacy of Pope John Paul II is this ambassador, is this apostolate, really back to the church of the teachings, and understanding them as something that are real, that are vivacious, that are living, and that are relevant to everything that we're dealing with now. So I think his legacy will be both in this body of work and how it's penetrated all of his other works, and the way the church views herself in the world now as being really that catalyst of enabling the Second Vatican Council to do what it intended to do.
Sure. Damon Owens with the Theology of the Body Institute. Thanks so much for joining us here today on Currents.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Stay with us. There's much more Currents ahead. Coming up, Pope John Paul will be beatified this weekend, but we'll have a look at someone else on the path to sainthood, Archbishop Sheen.
People are rediscovering, if they're of a certain age, and luckily discovering him and his life and his message if they're younger now.
And finally tonight, with all of the attention being focused on the upcoming beatification of Pope John Paul II, it should come as no surprise that the causes of other would-be saints might kind of fade into the background a little bit, if only for a moment. Well, never one to follow the herd, The Tablet, the weekly newspaper of the Diocese of Brooklyn, recently held a forum on another popular candidate for sainthood, Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. Sheen was a popular priest and Emmy Award-winning evangelist, probably best known for his television series, Life is Worth Living. Well, what's more, Archbishop Sheen actually met Pope John Paul II back in 1979, and the Pope praised Sheen for using media to evangelize. Well, 2 months later, Sheen passed away with that papal accolade in his heart. But as you'll see, the accolades have not stopped coming in.
The Tablet Forum is a series of film and lecture presentations that the Tablet is happy to host. We hold it all the time right here in Immaculate Conception Center in Douglaston. And tonight we had a crowd of about 400 people. I think this was the largest one we've ever had.
It was a privilege to know a man who was so close to God.
He was an unparalleled evangelist and preacher who made God's word as vivid and as convincing as anybody ever has.
The film really spoke a lot about his character. We all knew him as a media giant, and we knew how famous he was, and everybody saw him on television. But I don't think we realized, what a saintly man he really was. The fact that he spent an hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament every day in prayer, and really his devotion to the poor.
Copy of Time magazine from 1952 with Fulton Sheen on the cover.
There is this return, if not revival, of a lot of what Bishop Sheen said, because the message has been the same for 2,000 years. He was just a great articulator of it, and now because of the of the efforts behind a hopeful canonization. People are rediscovering, if they're of a certain age, and luckily discovering him and his life and his message if they're younger now.
And naturally, like everybody else, I was riveted to his presentation, and that's all I really knew about him until I had the pleasure and privilege of meeting him as a patient in Lenox Hill Hospital, and his penetrating eyes I will never ever forget. He asked me would I like to have his autograph, and I jumped at the idea. To my dear friend Teresa, whose kindliness and cheer helps make the sick well again, with my blessing, your friend in Christ, Fulton J. Sheen.
Well, I didn't know much about Archbishop Sheen before I entered the college seminary, but when I went on my sophomore year of retreat, I read a book by him, The Priest Is Not His Own, which was mentioned tonight, and it had a big effect on my life. I was just accepted to the major seminary in Huntington, and God willing, in a few years I'll be ordained a priest for the Diocese of Brooklyn. I have a copy of all of his talks, so I have them on my iPod. Pope Benedict had mentioned that we need new ways of bringing people to the faith, and Archbishop Sheen did that via radio, via television, and he would be a great saint for the new evangelization that needs to take place.
A pioneer of the new evangelization. Well, that is it for this edition of Currents, but be sure to tune in to the show tomorrow night. A local seminarian is going to sit down with us and tell us how Pope John Paul II inspired his vocation. And speaking of sharing your thoughts on Pope John Paul, why don't you share your comments on the beatification or your memories of the beloved Pope with us too? We'll make it easy for you, okay? Just drop us a line. Our email address is dropusaline@currentsny.net. We would love to read your thoughts on the air during our ongoing beatification coverage. And don't touch that dial or press that button. Right here at 8 p.m. exclusively on the net, we bring you John Paul II, the Pope who made history. It is a unique series that tells the story of Pope John Paul's life, including his childhood in Poland, his appointment as Pope, his most important foreign visits, and his final days. Be sure to watch each night at 8 right here on net. Well, for all of us here at Currents, I'm Matt McClure. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great night.